Hey, one more thing before you go. In this episode, bipolar disorder, suicide, overcoming grief after that suicide, continuing personal growth, and Soul Selves Framework. We're going to learn all of that and more when we have a conversation with an individual that lost her twin flame to suicide and now celebrates her grief. Stay tuned. I'm your host, Michael Herst. Welcome to One More Thing Before You Go. My guest in this episode is Carrie Scott. She's an author, a speaker, a designer, and a thought leader. In 2002, she was awakened by grief when she lost her twin flame to suicide. Now, because of that tragic death, her purpose in life is to align the energies of her heart and her throat to share her grief journey and inspire suicide survivors to break their silence. She's bringing voice to a silent epidemic. There's a lot of us that have been through this. I've been through this personally and professionally, so I'm looking forward to this conversation. This is an awakening journey that emerged the Soul Selves Framework, a mindset tool that brings awareness to the patterns of behavior that keeps us from becoming our authentic selves. In this episode, we're going to learn her journey, discuss the stigma around grief, death, suicide, and mental health. And if you're going through this yourself or know someone who is, how to celebrate that grief to transform your loss into self-love. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Kerri, I really appreciate your journey. As I said earlier before we started, I think that what you've come through and have been able to help others to motivate, to be inspired, to educate them, and to move them forward from this is a wonderful thing. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I really feel like I'm still at the beginning of this journey, even though my awakening has been going on probably for about 5 years now. But I know every time that I have the opportunity to share my story, I encounter someone else who has had a similar experience. And I think that has been the most beautiful part of this journey, is just sharing that space together, even if it's just for a brief moment, or if it makes a lifelong connection. It's those connections that I really cherish each time.
That's amazing. Yeah, because as we know, life can change in an instant. So to have that knowledge and that connection, actually, I think is a very important thing. As you know, from listening to the podcast, I love to kind of unfold your life. So like start at the beginning and kind of find out where you came from and some things like that, and how you got to where you're at. Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and I went to university at the University of Calgary. We lived honestly just a few blocks away, so I could walk to the university every day. And I decided to study astrophysics. And so I have a Bachelor of Science in Astrophysics. And during that time, when I was at university, I met a fellow. I thought he was the love of my life. And I actually had known him through my childhood. We always vacationed in the summer at this same retreat center. It's this little place in the Okanagan called Naramata Center. And the center itself was founded by my grandfather and a bunch of other United Church ministers. And so it has always held a special place for me in my heart. And it's kind of the place that you go and you learn about your spirituality, and you're welcomed, and anything is a go there. It's just such an open, loving place. And I've made such strong friendships and met so many people over the years while I was there. So that was always a time in my life that I looked forward to summer after summer. So during my time in university, I met Gabriel, as I refer to him in the book. And he and I dated long distance for a little while. It was after I graduated from university that he and I sort of split ways, and he was diagnosed with bipolar illness in 2001, and then by 2002 he took his life by suicide.
Yeah, that suicide is it affects each one of us as survivors. As you know that we that have been affected by suicide. It sounds very. It's an interesting approach to call us survivors, but we are, because, as you know, we have to experience that over and over again. Sometimes in the grief, the anger, the depression, the anything that you experience when losing someone, it kind of is emphasized when it's with suicide because of so many other factors that play into this. When you, if I can backtrack just a second, if you don't mind, what did you go to university for?
Oh, when I studied astrophysics.
Astrophysics. That's a very interesting subject, actually. What did you want to be when you grew up, sort of coming from that arena?
It's so funny because I always wanted to be a fashion designer, but the university didn't offer fashion design. And so at the time, I was really strong in math and I enjoyed physics. And I was actually at Naramata Center for sort of a youth retreat that is called Winter Session. And a comet was flying through the sky. It was the comet Haku-Taki. So this would have been, what year was that? 1996, I think. And it just inspired me. And it gave me the idea that I should study astronomy. And at the University of Calgary, they didn't have a department of astronomy. They had a department of astrophysics. So that was the course that
What a contrast from fashion designer to astrophysicist.
It's funny because during one of the summers, I actually went to study fashion design at Parsons in New York for like a 6-week summer program. And so the running joke was that I'd be designing spacesuits or something like that as a career. But yeah.
Oh, that's very cool. Very cool. So now Gabriel went to the same school. Where was he going when you first met him?
So actually, I met him again at Naramata Center. He grew up in California and he lived in California. And so our paths would cross in the summertime. And then we were at a youth Kairos youth conference in September of 1998 when we finally really took note of one another and started dating. And so we carried on a long distance relationship with me in Calgary and him in California for kind of the course of a few months over the next year, probably. So
now I know you refer to him as your twin flame in the notes that you sent me, and looked in your some information on your website and so forth. Help us understand what twin flame means.
Yeah, it's a funny thing for me. Twin flame is something that has helped me understand the depth of the relationship that I had with Gabriel, and it's still something that I still sort of struggle to embrace, but I haven't found a better term yet. So this is the one that I stick with. But essentially, as I started doing research, it's like soul mates, but at another level. So as I understand it, a twin flame is where we are two beings that have come from the same soul. So our souls like originated at the same time and then were split apart. And when we come back together in person, the sensations and the energy that's exchanged between us is kind of out of this world. Like it just feels like lifetimes have been brought together. Like there's this intensity of our relationship. And because of how intense that relationship is, there's also sort of this blowback, I guess, that happens, and it often can be described as one person running, and it causes us to go into the depths of our soul, to be able to really remove all of the trauma, remove all of the issues, and resolve all of those things that are unresolved in order for us, again, to come together in a true union. And I really felt that way with meeting Gabriel. Everything changed after that once we dated. And it took me probably almost 2 decades to acknowledge the work that I needed to start doing. But once I turned that sort of lens inward on myself and did the work to be able to release the trauma and understand my limiting beliefs and so on, huge shifts have started to happen in my life. And I really feel that even though Gabriel is in spirit, he has become closer in that sense, and he's really supported me on this journey. And so I never really feel like I'm without him. He's always got a certain presence, and he makes that presence known really regularly now, which is coming from where I was when I was deep in my grief to where I feel like I am now. It's a world of difference, and I feel so much more celebratory, as the title of the book suggests, that my grief isn't a painful place to be anymore.
If we can go back a little bit on that journey, did he have any type of like a suicidal ideology or anything that would indicate that he was going to take his own life? Or I know that you said he was diagnosed with bipolar. And do you think that that contributed to that situation and that downfall?
Absolutely. This has been part of my journey, is figuring out what those last few years of his life looked like. Because when we were together, when we were dating, there was no clear indication that he was living with a mental illness. And it wasn't until after that he got his diagnosis. And during those few years, well, really the last year of his life, we would communicate by telephone, but he never discussed with me what he was going through. And so after he passed, I learned that he had attempted suicide numerous times, as well as was on medication for his bipolar symptoms. But the idea that he was suicidal, I've learned now, is really a symptom of bipolar illness. So when you're having those thoughts and you're in that place, and suicide becomes something that you're thinking about regularly, that itself is a symptom of the illness. And I've never been able to consider it that way until recently, but having that information, I think, is really helpful for somebody struggling with bipolar illness to recognize that and say, look, okay, this is what I'm thinking, this is what's going on for me, this is when I need to ask for help or do the steps that they know to do in order to move themselves back into a place of more regulation.
I agree with that. And, and not everybody that commits suicide has bipolar. I mean, they go through depression, anxiety. As we started about and prefaced earlier when we were talking before this started, I lost one of my best friends, actually, the godfather of my kids, another law enforcement officer. I got him into law enforcement, never expected him to take his own life. And everything, I talked to him a week before he took his life, and everything seemed to be perfectly fine. Nobody would have even known that this was going to or coming about. Obviously there were some things that led up to his situation that were long held. He'd been involved in a shooting. He'd been involved in some other things, and I think that played a contributing factor in his particular case. But those of you that are out there listening and watching, sometimes there isn't any indication that they're going to do this. Sometimes it is I won't say a split second decision, but they don't tell anybody. They keep it to themselves, and and then it's just done and it's over with. And I think, you may have felt the same way, because I know grief has affected you for a long time. Sometimes we take on that. We take on that grief for a really long time. It's not the normal grieving process after losing somebody, because, and again, I'd like to know your feelings on this, but sometimes we have to get over. Do we blame ourselves? Is there something I could have done? Why couldn't I see this? Why couldn't I reach out? Was there more that I can do? And things like that. Did you go through any or all of those?
All of them, absolutely. I probably had those questions going through my mind on a daily basis. And I think that's one of the greatest things that suicide survivors like us struggle with, is those unresolved questions and the constant grief, or the constant guilt and shame that we take on as individuals as we're trying to understand what happened. And because suicide is such a sudden thing, it just amplifies those feelings in a way that really silences us. And we mentioned this before, when it comes to death, it's a hard topic to talk about. It's uncomfortable, and it's not something that we normally do. And then if that death is a suicide, then that just adds another layer of complexity to the situation, because that again is something that has so much shame and so much guilt and so many unresolved and unknowns surrounding it, that it adds to the silence. And then if that suicide was caused by mental illness, again, there's more complexity and more silence added to it, because we have, in our society, not made it okay to talk about mental illness. And then in my case, because it was an ex-boyfriend and somebody that I wasn't seeing and somebody who wasn't in my life, it just sort of eliminated the conversation about my grief altogether, because all of these sort of shameful, silent topics just compounded to make the whole conversation just non-existent. It just wasn't something that felt okay to talk about it. And so having the inspiration, or allowing myself to be vulnerable to talk about all of these things, has really lifted a huge weight that I carried for almost 2 decades in silence. And like I said, it just has been able to open up the conversation for other people to talk about their experiences.
Yeah, which is a good thing. I mean, it's you mentioned it earlier. Excuse me. Death in society, at least in the United States, death is a taboo subject. We don't talk about it. If somebody dies, we usually don't hear the details of it unless you see it on the news. And even then, it's not expanded upon very much. Personally, within our family lives, death isn't, I think, discussed in such a way that gives children growing up to an understanding of what death is and what it means, and what happens when somebody dies. Suicide is I told you that I've had more than one individual. Another friend of mine, firefighter, AMT, he also committed suicide, and another cop that committed suicide. It is something within ourselves that, and we were in different states, because I moved from Colorado to Arizona, and I was a cop in Colorado. So these people I'd known in Colorado, not here, which made it more difficult for me as well to help, to deal with it and manage it, because of that distance that was there. And although I talked to them on the phone regularly, it was one of those situations that the compoundings, what you were feeling, all came present. I in my position as a cop, dealt with death on a more frequent basis, which made it a little bit easier, saying I understand, because this stuff kind of happens. And investigating suicides, I always felt empathy and compassion for the people that I was delivering those messages to. because I did understand it. I did empathize with it from that perspective. But each and every time I did it, I really I felt kind of bad and guilty myself for having to deliver that message.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
I can't imagine. One of the sort of situations that I explore and celebrate your grief is because when Gabriel committed suicide, he stepped in front of a train, and so I
Oh,
often wonder, like, what was the scene, that unfolded with the driver of the train, and then in the hospital, and well, and I mean, even before he made it to the hospital, like all of um, uh, the ambulance drivers and the people that sort of came to
all the
help
first
him,
responders.
thank you, the first responders, what was their experience having to deal with that. So it's really it's quite sacred to have this conversation with you, being a first responder and having all of those firsthand experiences, and knowing the empathy that you held in that moment for the person as well as their family, because it's such a traumatic experience. And yeah, it's obviously not anything we would wish on anybody. So
Well,
yeah,
and coming from a first responder, I can tell you that any death that we had gone to, whether it be a homicide, a suicide, or unattended death, or an intended death, it is, we are still human beings. And in that particular instance, we have to, as a first responder, whether you be a police officer, firefighter, or an EMT, a doctor, or nurse, you have to create a certain boundary around you, because if you allow it to compound upon you, you can't effectively do your job. So that's why a lot of people in first responders end up drinking or other stuff, because they've had to compress that and push it down inside. But I can give you my word that whoever responded to that had empathy and compassion for you. So it's, anytime I had 5 suicides during one Christmas Eve, Christmas Day that I investigated, and that was the most difficult holiday that still sticks with me to this day.
yeah.
Having to deliver those messages on those days, and it makes you stop and wonder. How were you informed that Gabriel had committed suicide?
I heard from a friend. We had a mutual friend, and he had called me and let me know over the phone. So yeah, I still remember that phone conversation too, and my sister was there in our house at the time, and she remembers my reaction on the phone, and she knew instantly, something
What was
horrible had
going on?
happened. And yeah, yeah, yeah.
What happened?
That's not a message that I can't even, I mean, to imagine um, having to deliver that message to somebody too. That it's just such a difficult thing to have to say. Yeah.
It is. I will say that, yes, it is. So again, we're still human, and it affects us, and we carry that with us as we move forward in life. That's why you see some cops that go back and start investigating cold cases, because they had cases that they couldn't solve. And they went. A detective Lou Smith from the Colorado Springs Police Department, that he was one of those kind of guys. He was like, I walk a mile in their shoes.
Yeah.
And, no matter what it was, whether it be suicide or homicide, he was a homicide investigator, but, it has to start somewhere. And he says every time he took on a case, it was, I'm going to walk a mile in that person's shoes. And he took it to heart, actually. It was he's a very good guy, very good guy. He's passed, but, so he's not doing that any longer, but maybe from the other side he is. How long
That I
did
can believe it.
I know that you carried an immense amount of guilt and shame, which we just talked about. How did you kind of start to recognize that you needed to get a deeper understanding of how to manage that?
I I had an interesting experience on my 40th birthday, and as a birthday present to myself, I went into a sensory deprivation tank, or a float tank. And so at the time, my children were both quite young, and I thought that having like an hour of alone time in pure silence would be, the greatest gift that I could give myself.
I can relate to that. As a parent, yes.
Yes, yeah. So I realized quite quickly once I was in there that silence wasn't achievable. I have, this constant ringing in my ears, and then, the thoughts start coming and churning, and so it's quite an interesting experience thinking, you're going to have this peace, but you really don't, because the peace has to come from within you. And I had to recall how to meditate, because it's not something that I had practiced regularly. And in that sensory deprivation tank, I sort of started concentrating on all the different chakras in my body, and paying attention to sort of the thoughts that arose at each one. And I remembered to sort of like trap each thought in a bubble and let them float away, and on it went. But when it came to my heart chakra, I had this immense pain that started to come forth, and the tears started to flow, and as my tears were dripping into the saltwater bath, the salt was leaking back into my eyes and making them sting even more. And so it was this whole sort of like cacophony of emotions and sensations that was happening, and so much of that pain I realized was because of the loss that I felt with Gabriel. And he, was so much a part of my heart that I felt sort of this energetic block there. And I knew that if I was going to, live the next 40 years of my life, I needed to resolve that, because it was something that I knew I thought about every day, but nobody else knew that I thought about every day. And it just wasn't, there wasn't a balance between the life that I was living externally and the life that I was living inside of my mind, and the thoughts that I was having, right? I needed to somehow merge those two in order to carry on in a healthy way. And so once I realized that, I started exploring meditation again, and I started opening myself up to spirituality, and I had to acknowledge that I had some sensitivities, like extreme sensitivities around suicide, and obviously around any of the reminders that would come up in life around Gabriel. And I really had to sit with them and release them. And so part of my journey and part of my writing journey was doing research and reading about suicide and suicide survivors. And I came across this one book called Silent Grief, I believe it was called. And it said that suicide survivors have a different experience with grief. They often become frozen in their grief, and isn't something that is processed potentially for many, many, many years. And that really resonated. I didn't realize until I read that that's what was happening to me. I thought that the way that I was grieving was normal, and I thought that everybody grieved this way. And I didn't know that I should be talking about it. I didn't know that I could feel differently about it. I didn't know that I didn't have to let it go, and that I didn't have to move on. And all these other, I would say, all these other ways of grieving started to come into my reality, and it helped me sort of resolve the way that I was feeling, and really normalize the experiences that I was having, and make it okay. Because I think for those 2 decades, I put my grief in sort of, I compartmentalized it and put it away, and I only would let it out in the places where I felt it was safe, and that was when I was very much alone and in a private place. And I avoided all other circumstances in my life where I know that I would be triggered by that grief, like going to yoga or going to church and listening to certain songs. I just separated that out so that it wouldn't become an issue. But by doing that, I was also putting part of myself away, and so I wasn't being completely authentic to who I was, and essentially, like my grief had its very own ego, and it was protecting me from things that I didn't need to be protected from on some level. So,
can I ask you something? Can I interrupt just for 1 second? So had you practiced, because you mentioned you put that stuff away like yoga and you couldn't meditate. Had you been practicing meditation and yoga prior to this whole incident, and it kind of put a stop, or it halted your progress with meditation and yoga from that perspective?
So when Gabriel and I dated, our relationship was very rooted in spirituality. He was a very spiritual person, and he had a great understanding of spiritual concepts, and it was something that we talked about quite a lot. And so after he passed, I realized that exploring that part of myself wasn't comfortable anymore because I always found him there. And so I eventually just stopped doing that. Like, I would try and go to a yoga class, and at the end of each class you end up in shavasana, where you're lying in the corpse pose, and that stillness was just enough space for my thoughts to go to him. And so inevitably I would end up in my full-on grief state and crying, and I wouldn't want anybody to know, so I would just lie there as still as I possibly could and wait for the tears to dry on my cheeks, and hope that nobody noticed, and try not to make a snorkeling sound, and it was just so uncomfortable to be in that grief and in a public place that I just stopped going. And then, like, other places would be when like people were singing in a choir, children were singing, like all of those states that are so typically beautiful and really bring you into sort of a higher, sort of more spiritual, sacred place. I couldn't participate in those activities anymore because they just were such a trigger for me and such a trigger for my grief, because, like I said, Gabriel was there in all of those situations.
So then once you went into the deprivation tank, that gave you the opportunity to kind of reawaken from that point, to kind of reawaken your grief and recognize it and start working through it then?
Exactly. Yeah. And that's when I really started writing Celebrate Your Grief. And so Celebrate Your Grief was written as I was having this grief awakening and learning the learnings that I was having sort of on a moment by moment basis. The writing of it helped me uncover so many beautiful gifts that I didn't even know were possible, and it helped me sort of tap into the sort of communication that I feel Gabriel and I share, and he really would lead me to find information about him and information about myself that I needed to learn, and it just every day there was sort of this new uncovery and experience as it unfolded.
Do you think that, from that perspective, how do you think grief transformed you?
It made me, I think one of the core learnings that I had was that it wasn't so much Gabriel that I was missing, it was me. I have this quote, I'll read it to you, because this one really changed my view as I was writing. It's from Miriam Hasna. It says, "When you feel a void from missing someone, what you're actually feeling is missing the connection to yourself that you have when you are with that person." And so I made the connection that when I was connecting with my higher self, it was Gabriel's voice that I could hear. And I realized that when we were together, and the joy that we were feeling, and the love that I felt for him, it was actually a complete reflection of the love that my higher self had for me. And so being able to understand that reflection piece, and like how critical that was, I realized that I could still find that sensation of love that I felt when I felt with him, and that I always associated only with him. But I could now find that anytime within myself if I just tuned into it. And so it was just a matter of realigning the way that I was approaching my life and approaching my thoughts, and shifting my beliefs to accept that I didn't need him specifically to be alive and in my life and present all the time, in order to feel that way. I could feel that way anytime, because it was always just my higher self reflecting to me how much love I'm capable of feeling for me or anyone at any given time.
That's amazing. That's brilliant, actually. Do you think that it put you back on a spiritual path that you felt you were missing? Uh,
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like this was the path I was always meant to be on, and I just kept pushing it away and pushing it away, because it was too painful, and I didn't have the skills to deal with it, and I didn't know that
right.
I I was supposed to, or I wasn't allowing myself to be able to feel the grief that I needed to feel, and process it. And so being on this path feels like, it feels like coming home. Like it feels like the place I was always meant to be, and just recognizing, to put myself on that edge of vulnerability all the time is where that expansion happens. And and then by tuning into, that infinite sort of unconditional love for myself, I am walking into, or opening myself up to, this infinite potential that
Right.
I didn't even realize was possible. And so it's so rewarding and so exhilarating. And I want everybody to feel this way, as much as possible, because it's such a gift to be able to recognize that it's all within us. It always has been, all the time.
Yeah, I I applaud you for that statement, because in reality, I think we all need to recognize that we can go on our own individual spiritual journeys, no matter what the circumstances, and look deep within inside ourselves to understand that the light that we're seeking is within us, and that we can just bring that forward and bring it out of us to kind of help us move forward, as well as others, to help others move out of that as well. Um, how do you think, how should let me ask this correctly? How can we recognize when we need to take that step towards reaching deep inside ourselves to reconnect with the spiritual side?
So tell me if you can hear me okay. My headphones ran out of juice, so
I can.
okay. uh, I in this journey, I recognize that there are sort of stages, or what I call markers, on this journey to self-realization. And this is where my Soul Selves framework emerged from my grief journey, and from writing Celebrate Your Grief. And the 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 first sense of that is when we're firmly rooted in our ego. And this is the place that I call the bodily self. So it's like the first marker of the Soul Selves framework. And
Kitty cat saying hi.
saying hi, yeah. She does this regularly. Here we go.
That's okay. I'm a cat person, so it's all good.
So in the bodily self, it's a time when we feel like a victim. And often, I think a lot of us sort of go through life, and I know I'm completely guilty of this. I went through the majority of, the first 40 years of my life in this sort of victim mentality. And I didn't realize there was another way of looking at life. And I thought, well, I'll feel better if so and so does this, or I'll feel better, if that didn't happen, or, you come up with all these excuses and blame outside of yourself. So, you're looking at the world externally and reacting to it, rather than realizing that we as individuals have the power to create the reality that exists in our day-to-day lives. And so I think that sort of the first step for me has always been to recognize now when I'm having those thoughts and when I'm having those conversations about being a victim, and what is it that I'm a victim of, and how is my ego showing up and taking control or taking the power away from my soul in this moment. And so acknowledging that and taking responsibility, that was a huge part of my awakening journey. Just taking responsibility for those thoughts and those actions, and then I think once we do that, the guidance starts to show up for us as we become more open to it.
Do you think? That's a great way of looking at the perspective. I think that being able to recognize it, number one, is beneficial, because once we recognize it, then we can embrace it, and it's really important. Excuse me. I'm just getting over a slight chest issue, so my apologies.
I understand.
From this perspective, I know that I'd like to kind of explore this. Kitty cat came up to say hi. What's your cat's name?
This is Rose.
Rose. Hello, Rose. Yeah. It's nice to meet you. What does it, coming from that perspective, I know that the book, like you made reference to the book, the fact you started writing it and putting your thoughts and everything involved with that. What does it mean to celebrate your grief from that perspective? Because sometimes, I know that we've discussed briefly that, as a suicide survivor, from the perspective of being an ex-boyfriend, a girlfriend, a husband, a wife, a spouse, a son, a daughter, a grandma, anybody that's very close to us that happens to commit suicide, we carry that guilt with us for some time, and that grief with us. And as you said earlier, we grieve differently. And it is different than losing a friend to natural death, or even to like a car crash or something like that, or a heart attack or something that happens to take place. We are indoctrinated to kind of understand that there's a pattern we go through: anger, depression. And I know that those 5 rules they weren't designed to fit that way, but unfortunately our innate mentality takes us through that. But and forgive me in order to celebrate grief, compared to feeling it, holding it, embracing it, how do we celebrate grief?
So it's interesting that you bring up the 5 stages of grief, because as I was writing this, the 6th stage was released in a book, and the 6th stage is finding meaning. And I felt like that's what I was finally doing in writing about this and opening myself up about it and being vulnerable. I was finding meaning in this death that held no meaning to me for 2 decades. And that is one of the ways that I was celebrating. And the sort of the purpose of celebrating any achievement or any blessing that comes into your life is so that more of it will be attracted to you. So when I say celebrate your grief, I don't mean to attract more grief into my life by any means, but what I want to attract more of is that connection that I found with myself because of the grief experience and the grief journey that I went on. I wanted to celebrate that I had found this deep self-love, and that I realized it was available to me all the time, and that I could go to it um, and and be in that space more and more of the time, and sort of allow what the universe was going to bring to me, and allow that potential and that expansion to come more and more of the time. And then in addition to that, um, I learned that I have this sort of emotional guidance system that is one of the tools that I can use on my day-to-day journey to help me navigate um, that that experience from the ego to the soul, and in any aspect of my life. And this is where, again, the Soul Selves framework kind of comes in to explain that journey a little bit more. But I was celebrating when I felt good, and when I felt joyful, and when I felt happiness. And then when I was having sort of a negative reaction to an experience, or being and triggered by something, then I was finally able to recognize that that's not how my higher self wanted me to feel about that situation. And so it was up to me to change my thoughts and change my beliefs in order to get more in alignment with that higher self, or with source energy. And so there were all these ways that started to emerge that were really worth celebrating, because I had finally taken the time to turn my awareness inward and start creating my existence and creating my reality, and embracing, and that, how powerful I truly am as an individual with the thoughts that I hold. And so um yeah, it's become sort of a daily practice for me to um look at the things that I'm grateful for in my life, and celebrate them, so that I can attract more of that to me.
Could you give me, could you help us understand maybe some steps that others that are going through the same journeys that you and I both have gone through? You have come out brilliantly in able to create this framework, as you had mentioned earlier, in regard to helping other people move forward. Can you give us some steps that people that are going through it now might take to help start to heal from all this?
Yeah, I think one of the most important steps, and one that I overlooked for so long, was just honoring the emotion that you're feeling at the time that you're feeling it. So when that grief arises, you just have to sit with it, and let it flow through you, because I was so afraid of showing that emotion outside of myself, or publicly, that I suppressed it and suppressed it, and all of that gets trapped in your body. And that's, I think, where the health concerns start to arise, and whatnot. So I I would strongly recommend just allowing those emotions to surface. And it sort of starts as emotional intelligence, in terms of like naming that emotion as it arises, and somehow by giving it a name, it lessens it. It sort of takes some of the power away. And so then, once we've processed that, we can sort of take a step back and ask, okay, what was the trigger there? What caused that emotion to happen? And do I, and then ask yourself, like, do you want to continue to feel that way? Or can you now look at that situation, or look at that trigger from a new perspective, and change the emotional response that you have to it? Can you change that belief that you have about a situation, or about a loss, to make it more positive? Or it doesn't even have to jump that extremely from a really negative guilt sort of feeling to one of happiness. It doesn't necessarily happen that quickly, but like just take one step up the emotional ladder, so to speak, just to feel a little bit better and a little bit better and a little bit better. And it's a really gradual process, and it's a practice, and you just have to keep reminding yourself. And that's, I think, part of the beauty of the experience is that we forget every day we wake up and we have these emotions, and we forget how much control we have over our lives. But as we practice and remember a little bit more every day, we just can feel a little bit better and a little bit better and a little bit better. And eventually you can, be in that transcendent space too, is have unconditional love. And then you're there more and more of the time.
That's brilliant, actually, yes. I think we just need to take the first step and then take the next step and the next step and the next step. That helps us to move forward. Um, I know that you've contributed to one book, Prosperity Codes, that our friend Bridget is about ready to publish. That it may have been published. It's coming out the 3rd. Has it already been published?
Yeah. Just last Tuesday it was published.
Last
So
Tuesday?
yeah.
And then you've obviously we talked about the one that you actually have been writing yourself, which is Celebrate Your Grief. Have you always wanted to be an author, or that this is something that when you started finding your new purpose, that this evolved?
Yeah, I never thought I was a good writer. Like I said earlier, I was really strong in math and physics and sort of that science based stuff. And writing was something that really terrified me. And so I didn't know that I would be on this journey and be where I am now. And it started, oh gosh, maybe 7 years ago now. I was lab assistant at an environmental lab in town, and they got bought by another company, and so I was laid off. And I that was an ego breaking moment for me. It really sort of cracked me open, and I had to redefine myself. And as I said before, I always wanted to be a fashion designer, and I thought, well, now here's my opportunity to dedicate myself to exploring this as a possibility. And I did a year-long design project, a zero waste design project, where I created a garment out of 1 yard of material every week for a year. And then I blogged about it. And so I got more feedback about my writing than I did about the designs that I was creating. And so that kind of started the whole writing process for me. And the next blog I started was called Exercise Your Breath. And I started writing about different breathwork techniques and practicing them. And it just evolved into me writing a book. And I mean, the first book that I started writing, I think I've started writing a few now, but they were very different than what ended up becoming Celebrate Your Grief. And so every step has just sort of propelled me along this journey. And I didn't realize that my purpose was to talk about self-love and to talk about this self-realization journey, and share the idea that we're capable of creating our own realities. But now that I'm here, it feels really rooted, and I'm happy to have that as my purpose in life. So
It's a really good feeling when you connect with your purpose and you understand what you're doing here and how you got there. I relate to you in regard to that. I had to reinvent my life after I got injured on the job, and I was told I couldn't be a cop anymore, and got put in a wheelchair. I was told I'd be in that wheelchair for like the rest of my life. And I will tell you that I walked my oldest daughter down the aisle, and the wheelchair's in the garage. So, I reinvented my life and created new purpose. And that's why I talk to people all over the world on One More Thing Before You Go, and tell brilliant stories like yours.
yeah.
Of coming from a dark place and into a light place, and triumph over tragedy, and overcoming grief, loss, and moving forward, and getting to say what you didn't get to say. That's why we're here. So that's a fantastic thing. You also have a website that you help people with, that they can reach out to you, and you can help them through their grief.
Yeah, kerriscott.com. And I have my Soul Selves Framework on there, and there is a quiz that people can go and take to determine which soul self they are currently residing in, which is sort of a fun sort of personality test for your soul, if anybody's interested in taking that.
I think I think it would be very interesting. In fact, I want to make sure that I put that link as well as your website. I'll put a link directly to that in the show notes so that we've got it. Celebrate your grief. When can we expect to be able to obtain it?
Oh, I wish I had a date for you, but I don't yet. It's out with beta readers right now, and I sense there's going to be at least one more big edit before I can really tie a bow on it and start sending it out to agents and looking for a publisher. But yeah, hopefully within the year. I mean, that would be amazing if it all came together in the next year. So we'll just put it out there and say 2023.
That would be great. But looking forward to it. This is one more thing before you go. So before we go, do you have any advice for anybody else or words of wisdom that are going through what you and I have gone through?
I would say that it is important to remember that we are supposed to feel good, that it is our birthright to feel bliss. And when we're feeling something different, to tune into that and to question it and question our beliefs, because our beliefs are really malleable and we are capable of changing them so that they become more in alignment with who we authentically are. So yeah, question your beliefs often.
It's amazing words of wisdom. Thank you very much. I think that everybody should take that to heart. Kerri, I really am grateful that Bridget connected us. Thank you very much for coming on and sharing your story and your journey. I think that what you have created is a very positive environment to help people move forward in their lives. So thank you for being on the show and joining us in this conversation.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I appreciate it so much. It's always a pleasure to be able to share my story.
Thanks for listening to this episode of One More Thing Before You Go, a unique conversation about life. If you like our show and want to know more, check out our website at beforeyougopodcast.com. That's beforeyougopodcast.com. Tell your story, share your expertise, contribute to the blog, and subscribe to the newsletter. You can find us as well as subscribe to the program and rate us on your favorite podcast listening platform.
And one more thing before you go. Have a nice day, have a nice week, and thanks for listening.
One More Thing Before You Go, a unique conversation about life podcast, is a creation of One More Thing Productions, established 2010, all rights reserved.